Hello, you're listening to the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another Canada update. Before I get started though, I would just once again like to shout out my channel members. Your contributions to the channel really help out and it's greatly appreciated. If you guys want to support the channel, by all means go and join below. If you cannot afford to do a monthly donation, I perfectly understand. In that case, just do your regular YouTube things like, share, subscribe, and comment below. But with no further ado, let us begin. So we've seen a story develop over the last few months here, since about July 1st, where the Conservative lead keeps increasing and increasing. We're now in our fourth month of this, and they're now firmly in majority territory, and they still have more room to grow. Things are trending to over 200 Conservative seats right now, but they're not quite there yet. If you look at other aggregators, such as 338, he has the Conservatives over 200 seats right now. And I don't think his projection is wrong, I just think it's overly sensitive. I don't think it's quite accurate to have the model change that fast right now, because we're in between elections, and some people are not paying attention, and messaging is not going to be quite there yet for all the parties. But make no mistake, that is where things are trending if trends don't change. If polls keep being presented as they currently are, the current leading edge of polling is CPC 13 to 15. If we keep seeing polls like that, we are going to be creeping into the Conservatives having 40% more than 40% of the popular vote, in winning more than 200 seats. And just looking at this map here, it's very clear where we have plenty of Conservative seats that they can still pick up. Going east to west, they have PEI, Nova Scotia, Ottawa. They have some in Quebec here. They have tons in the GTA. They have some in rural. They still have Thunder Bay Superior North here. They still have some in London. They have a bunch in Winnipeg. They still have a bunch in BC in general. It's very clear where there is still a path to gain seats. And as they continue getting more popular vote, that path is only going to increase more. What we're actually starting to see now isn't that the Conservatives are doing really well in Atlantic, or really well in Ontario, or really well in BC. That's old news. They're starting to pull well in Quebec. Now, make no mistake here. This does not mean the Conservatives are likely to gain many seats in Quebec, because the Conservative vote in Quebec is not very efficient. We bring up our raw data here. We can see here, in my model, they are in third place, and they're down about 8.5 points in the mid-20s, or low 20s. For the Conservatives to actually gain seats in Quebec, a meaningful number of seats, a relevant number of seats, the Conservatives need to bring their vote share into the 30s. And the most cutting-edge polls aren't there yet. We're seeing in some of the more recent polls from Ledgers or Abacus or Main Street that they're in the mid to high 20s, but they're not quite in the 30s yet. And if we're looking at some of the most aggressive ones that have 27% Conservative in Quebec, that was the most recent Main Street poll, there we see, if that were to happen, we're going to be looking at a couple of pickups, maybe 4 to 6 range, which is actually solid. By no means, that's not a bad number of pickups. But it's not jaw-dropping yet. But the reason why this is particularly interesting is this is just starting to turn. If you remember way back in March, especially if you follow me on Twitter, I was just reporting how the Atlantic was starting to turn. At the time there was looking only 1 or 2 pickups in Atlantic. And now, if we look at the raw map, we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pickups. And there's more on the horizon. So right now, it's early days in Quebec. And we're only seeing a few potential pickups for the Conservatives there on the board. And while I'm not a Quebec resident, as opposed to the fact I am Nova Scotian, so I have more insight on the ground here in the Atlantic. So I won't speculate too hard on the internal trends in Quebec. But I do talk to Quebecers, and we do have the polls. And what it seems like is happening in Quebec, and why Quebec is evolving slower than Anglo-Canada, is twofold reasons. The first, the Quebecers vote or care more about their provincial assembly than the federal one, especially francophones. More so than every other province. So they don't pay as much attention to federal politics between elections. Secondly, a lot of the media about Poilievre has been English language media, and a lot of Quebecers listen and or interact with the media mostly in French. So they haven't had the same amount of messaging hit them yet. But over time, that will be filtered into French language media, and more French language content is going to be created from the Poilievre campaign. And this is going to keep creeping forward. So we should expect, if growth continues, that it will be slow and steady growth in Quebec. But they're not quite at their ceiling yet. And there is some, for the Conservatives, optimism there. Their ceiling in Quebec, based on polling from Nanos or Abacus, or other surrogate examples, if you look at approval ratings of Poilievre himself and do some tax on or estimates based on those, it looks like the Conservative ceiling in Quebec is in the mid-30s, 35 plus or minus 3-ish range, right? Now, usually a party will never hit their ceiling, but usually the Conservatives or right-wingers in general will perform closer to their ceiling than they do to their floor. So there is plenty of room for the Conservatives to grow in Quebec based on this data. And if they do somehow hit their ceiling, or their ceiling expands further up, 35% range would be returning dozens of seats for the Conservatives, possibly in the 20s. That would be very strong performance. Now, we do start getting into some tricky issues when you're trying to project Quebec specifically, because it is very much a 3-party province, if not 4 in some cases, and such as Montreal. That it can be very difficult to predict exactly where seats are going to change with such a seismic movement of voters, if that does occur. Because it's not necessarily obvious if these are coming from rural areas, if they're coming from Montreal, if they're coming from Quebec City. The safe bet historically is that this Quebec City area, Trois-Rivières, Quebec City itself, eastern townships here, up along this north central shore. I can't think of the proper name for the Saguenay. I think it's Saguenay. That's usually where the Conservatives have done the best. Places like Pontiac and Ste. Marie Champlain have also been areas they have won before in recent memory. So that's normally where you would expect, but that's not necessarily where we're going to see them gain. It could be, but not necessarily, and it's hard to predict that. But we will have to wait and see as polls emerge. Maybe the polling will be clear enough that that will be clear. Maybe it won't be. But the more general and more important factor here is that this is devastating news. Very devastating news for the Liberals. But it doesn't get much better. So Main Street has been recently added vote intention by racial group. This is very new for Canadian pollsters, and it's very interesting data. Now, I'm not using it yet just because we only really have Main Street doing it, and I get a little worried about taking only one pollster If I can see another pollster who somewhat regularly posting data like that, I might work with it. But with only one, it's very difficult. Because then I'm trusting entirely if Main Street is correct or not, which kind of goes against the spirit of model aggregation, of polling aggregation, which is to not trust one single pollster. But the data from Main Street is very interesting, and it could cause some big changes. This kind of data is the stuff that would actually be very useful in a model. Namely, some of the racial samples are very different than what historically has been the case in Canada. Namely, South Asians. Specifically Indians and Sikhs and Pakistanis, or Bengalis too, I believe. But the Sikhs and the Indian ones are the more interesting combination because those two groups make up more of a population of Canada. Notably, these groups are very concentrated in places like Brampton, Surrey, among just two cities where they're very common, or it's not very common, where South Asians make up a very large percentage of the population. I believe Brampton's like 50%. If the polling is correct, this would actually imply that Brampton isn't fairly safe liberal right now, that it is actually fairly safe conservative, that is 5 seat flips right there. Possibly 6 if we start spilling into Milton, depending on exactly how the math works out. This is quite a big bomb for the Liberals. This could change the somewhat competitive but not entirely hopeless situation to effectively a hopeless situation. Because make no mistake here, there isn't an obvious or real path to Liberals winning here. Now, there is a path for them to bleed less. If you look at just the most competitive ridings they have, they could easily push back up into the about 130 range if they won all of their most competitive races. And if the NDP start winning some of their competitive races, you could easily see either a hung parliament or maybe some weird esoteric 3-way block NDP Liberal deal, though that's very unlikely, but not impossible. But every day, every month, that seems to get further and further and further away. This kind of hope of a comeback. Now, that is not to say there is no hope of a comeback for the Liberals. That is not to say that this is a done and told election. But it is to say that every day that the Liberals don't make progress, they're getting further in the hole. And eventually it becomes a point of no return, that they can't make progress back. So why is that? Why are the Liberals just suddenly and now spectacularly seeming to be imploding? Just 2 years ago, they had won a midterm or a snap election, and they got 55 more seats than they currently have. They're losing 55 seats right now, and they're at risk in another 20. How is this happening? You might ask yourself. Well, it boils down to basically 3 things. And these 3 things have been the things that have been killing the Liberals this entire time, but it's taken an effective conservative leader to actually articulate and to give animus to opposition to it. Because the thing you need to understand about politics and power is you need someone in power, someone with power, someone in the upper group to advocate for your position to make headway. Okay, so what are these 3 things? Well, the first one is housing has been a disaster. Now, housing is a symptom of greater societal ills in Canada. Economic mismanagement, foreign speculation to excessive immigration rates for the ability to build houses, namely, but other issues too. So there's all sorts of things in that, but housing itself is a huge symptom. It's the one that regular people are going to feel first and hardest. It's very hard for you to be optimistic or happy about the status quo if you are spending all of your disposable income to tread water on your mortgage, to tread water on your rent payments. And the Liberals, having been in power for 8 years, and back in 2015, housing wasn't a disaster. Now, I wouldn't say it was good, but it wasn't a disaster. They have no benefit of the doubt. They took something that wasn't bad, but wasn't good, and they turned it into something that was horrific. Now, you could argue housing is not really their portfolio, or they didn't really do anything itself to hurt it. That's what a lot of people are doing. That's what the Liberals themselves are doing, arguing. Well, that misses really two key pieces. First, they did actually do something to make this worse. Namely, they increased immigration rates without doing anything to increase housing production rates. Now, realistically, they couldn't actually really reasonably increase housing production rates. That's not really a viable thing they could have done. But they at least didn't try. So if you already have a bad housing situation, or a mediocre one in 2015, that was trending worse, and then you put more people, but you don't increase construction, you get a disaster. So that's part of it. The other part of it was how they handled COVID for the housing catastrophe, specifically. The overly judicious lockdown combined with the overly generous benefits. A lot of people who did not need or deserve benefits got benefits in COVID. Really screwed up the economy, and that pays us into both one, where it made housing inflate. One of the worst parts of the worst periods of housing inflation was in 2020, 2021, 2022. Combination from zero interest rate policy. I won't use acronyms on video. Quantitative easing and just easy money being available and easy credit caused a huge boom in prices. But this also feeds into the second point, cost of living. Cost of living has also been a disaster. Now, the economy wasn't so hot when Trudeau took over. That's one of the reasons why he made the promise to run a few budget deficits and the budget would balance itself. That's where that originates from. The economy wasn't doing so good. Why wasn't it doing well? Well, basically, it wasn't doing well because of a commodities crunch. For various esoteric reasons, or not esoteric, but various reasons that I'm not going to get into here, the oil market collapsed in 2014-ish. Now, Canada, because our economy has been overly dependent on oil production, mostly because we don't actually do anything else here in the country. We basically sell houses and make oil. That's all we do. When the oil market crashed, the Canadian dollar crashed because we stopped exporting. Now, the crash of the Canadian dollar crashes the economy, partially, because it makes imports more expensive. Because the way Canada worked as a country pre-2014, pre this oil crash, was we exported oil, got foreign currency reserves from that, got money from that, propped up our dollar from that, and we used the higher value dollar and all this foreign currency that we're getting from selling oil to buy imported goods. Because a lot of things fundamentally are not produced in Canada. Most manufactured goods aren't produced here. We have some legacy industry in places like rural or small city Ontario or in some outskirts of the GTA, but it's pretty negligible these days, much to the chagrin of industry workers in Canada. So this collapse caused the Canadian dollar to fall. And this Canadian dollar fell caused imports to get more expensive, and it basically caused a recession, effectively. But from there, Trudeau didn't actually do anything to fix the problem. And that's where this becomes a disaster for him now. See, in 2015, he comes in promising that we're going to spend some money, run some deficits, and this is going to build up our productive capacity, fix the economy, and we're going to do well again. He ran those deficits, the budget never balanced itself, and the economy never got healthier. We are still utterly dependent on oil exports. Our manufacturing industry is basically still on death's door. Our mining industry is basically negligible because we can't build any mines anywhere. And on top of all of this, we have, again, his immigration policy coming to hurt everything. Our actual core economic output is effectively flat, controlling for inflation. Not entirely flat, but mostly flat. But then when you control for population growth, especially in the last few years, the economic output is actually negative. In other words, controlling for population size and controlling for inflation, the average Canadian is losing money. Their buying power is decreasing. And this is what's manifesting in the cost of living crisis right now. People can barely afford groceries, not only because they're spending all their money on their rent, but also because groceries are getting excessively expensive, or basic consumer goods are getting excessively expensive, but their incomes aren't actually growing that much because there's so many people coming into the country, and the economy can't absorb the immigration because there is no productivity capacity growth, period. In a sense, Canada is actually throwing away its only competitive advantage in economics, which is that it has all sorts of resources it can extract from the ground and sell them, because we don't want to do that for reason 3, which is Trudeau's excessive and over-the-top, almost nihilistic view of climate. Now, I'm not here to say that there's no climate change in the world, or that you should do nothing about the environment, but there is a difference between doing something and doing something that actively harms and sabotages your own citizens in a way that actually makes no sense. So the first of these, and the most obvious one, is the Alberta oil patch. Their main attack and their main opposition to places like Alberta oil patch is that we produce oil, the oil is consumed somewhere, and greenhouse gas emissions happen. And that's bad. The problem with that logic, and their logic is basically the Canadian average emissions per capita is going up. That means we're losing ground. But in reality, the world doesn't actually care if it's a Canadian, or if it's a Saudi, or if it's an Algerian, or if it's a Russian. Doesn't care. It's completely irrelevant. So where does this matter? Well, by attacking this industry and attacking mining for very similar reasons, attacking forestry for very similar reasons. And a lot of this is not even necessarily due with carbon emissions, but just nature conservation. There's a recent gold mine proposal in Nova Scotia that's likely going to get canned because they want to make that the area where the gold mine is a conservation area, as an example. What all of this does collectively means is we can't extract resources from the ground in Canada and sell them. So why is that a big deal? Well, that's basically Canada's only comparative advantage, economically. That's where the economy actually gets its money. We have a lot of anti-manufacturing regulations and a lot of free trade agreements that make it very difficult for manufacturing to flourish in Canada. And the same token, With the US right there and speaking the same language as the majority of the country, we can't really compete on high-end manufacturing or high-tech industries because the highest or the smartest, the brightest, the best Canadians usually just go to the US to work in tech, work in engineering. They don't stay in Canada to do those jobs because the money's not here, because the economy's poorer. So so you might ask yourselves, okay, so why should we produce oil in Alberta? That's still causing greenhouse gas emissions. That's still bad. Yes, it does. But that doesn't mean it's bad. Because for it to be bad, it has to be worse than the alternative. And the thing that is missed in a lot of these conversations, which are people in Canada are starting to acknowledge, and this is why the Conservatives are starting to gain a lot of ground on this, notably look at the carbon tax, which is now a good issue for the Conservatives. More people support the Conservative position on the carbon tax than the Liberal one. The reason why this is boiling into a winning issue for the Conservatives and a losing one for the Liberals is because it's not very clear why it's better to import oil from Algeria than it is to produce oil in Alberta. That is not clear to anybody. Doesn't really make any sense to anybody. If we're going to use it, it might as well be ours. But there's also the corollary to that, which is often missed in these conversations. And people are again starting to realize this right now, especially with this home heating rebate from the carbon tax going in for specifically oil furnaces. We actually need energy to heat our homes in the winter. It's really cold in Canada. Even in provinces like Nova Scotia, which is very mild, you still end up having to use thousands of dollars worth of heating oil to heat your home, or if you have natural gas, it's a bit cheaper. But there's also the other corollary to this too. This one is not talked about as much, but it's still an important factor. Society, physically, cannot survive without oil right now. And I don't mean as a fuel or as a lubricant. Basic things like plastic are made out of heavy crude. Most medicines use heavy crude as an input requirement to them, either in the manufacturing process or as actually part of the product. Turns out many medicines are based on hydrocarbons. Alberta makes heavy crude oil, which is usually the attack against it. Oh, that's a heavy oil that's really requires a lot to refine and use. Yes, that's true, but heavy crude is not the same thing as light crude. You don't use light hydrocarbons to make plastic. I guess you could, technically, but you don't, because heavy crude exists. You'd use the heavier, longer, bigger polymers. Same thing with things like asphalt. Asphalt is made out of bitumen, which is a product extracted from heavy crude production. With no heavy crude production, there would be no asphalt roads. End of story. So these three things, housing, cost of living, and environmental radicalism, are what's killing Trudeau. And they all link together because environmental radicalism is hurting the economy and hurting cost of living, things like the carbon tax, for example. The cost of living is making it hard to afford housing, so even if the housing crisis was unfixable by itself, if people made enough money, it'd be less of a problem. But they don't. But the cost of living problem wouldn't be as big an issue if people weren't spending 40, 50, 60% of their income on rent or mortgages. All three of these issues together are becoming unsolvable for the Liberals, at least in a 2-year period. Because it's not so much that the Liberals can't solve them. It remains to be seen if they have the will to do that. But the bigger issue is they don't have the time to solve them. Let's look at specifically Sean Fraser. Sean Fraser's been going around places like BC, Ontario, other provinces too, making deals with municipalities to get federal funding dollars in exchange for zoning reforms. Now, on paper, this sounds great. Hard to say this will actually end up in having more homes built. That remains to be seen. But the issue with this for the Liberals is it's probably a matter of a little too late. On average, it takes several years to build a house. You don't start a house in January and then finish it in December of next year or the same year. That doesn't happen. Even a simple detached house can take a while to build because in reality, you have to do surveying plans, you have to do preliminary site work, possibly digging out the foundation, putting the foundation in, etc. Then you have to actually have contractor time to build everything. And sure, you can, in reality, build one house in a summer if you do everything correctly. But in practice, that rarely ever happens. It usually takes 1, maybe 2 years for a new housing site to turn into a new house. The reason for that is there's not infinite developers, there's not infinite contractors, so those people are already usually on another project, so they can't just stop and start a new project. But secondly, there's not infinite materials in the world, so sometimes there are material shortages, particularly concrete can be in shortage, or at least on wait list, is a better way to phrase that. And then the third one is the legal process can often take a really long time, especially when you're talking about apartment buildings or condo buildings. Those can take a very long time to build. So what we're seeing here with the Liberals is they have basically done nothing to address people's concerns about overly zealous climate action. They've not done nothing to address people's concerns about cost of living. And their only efforts on housing are pretty long term. It's even debatable if those are even achievable goals. What's often left unsaid in the conversation about the Canadian housing crisis is Canada actually builds a lot of houses. We're one of the most constructive countries in the world. At least for countries that have easily available data. But those all happen to be peer countries like the UK, Australia, Japan, the US, etc. So it's not actually even clear with better zoning rules we could build more, or faster, or cheaper. That's not clear. It might be true, but that will be a many-year bet, and it won't likely come into fruition in 25. So does that mean the Liberals are screwed? No. But it means they're in a very desperate situation. They don't have a lot of wiggle room. If you look at historically, there's very few instances of a party this far behind in this short of a window after being in power for, by 25, 10 years to turn around. But again, nothing is impossible. They could do it. It's just every day they fail to accomplish momentum. It gets harder and harder and harder. And on the flip side, the Conservatives have everything going in their favor. The economy is trending worse. Housing is trending worse. Every time someone renews their mortgage and their interest rate goes from 2% or 3% or even 4% to 8%, to 6%. That's another potential conservative voter. Every time someone goes to the grocery store and realizes they can't afford to buy the food they need because food prices are going up too fast, that's another potential conservative voter. The economy trends and the housing trends systemically favor the conservatives right now because they're the ones who are saying we should do something about it before the liberals did, before the NDP did. And unlike the liberals and unlike the NDP, they're not in power or have the tools of power. The liberals and the NDP do, much to the chagrin of the NDP, who likes to claim they're not in cahoots with the liberals, but they do have an official deal on the books. They do have levers of power. They could be pushing Trudeau on some of these issues, but they're really not. Not in any meaningful fashion. Which is why, when we see this, and we see these polls, and we see my model time and time again, show the NDP losing 10 seats. This is why. In a sense, well, there's no such thing as inevitable. This election is probably inevitable. It would require a truly master hand or a total and colossal failure from Poilievre to turn this around. It could happen. But when Poilievre has positive approval ratings, when Trudeau has negative approval ratings, when Poilievre is trending more and more positive and Trudeau more and more negative, when all of the core issues in Canada are getting worse and worse and worse, and the government in charge is completely unwilling to change them, incapable of acting upon them, this is what you see. And should we really expect things to go differently when everything isn't going well? When was the last time an incumbent was doing well when the economy at large, in every facet, was doing horrible? I'll just finish with one anecdotal example. Houses in rural Nova Scotia. And when I say rural Nova Scotia, I mean towns that are 1,000, 2,000, maybe 10,000 people. Now, there's 2, maybe 3 types of homes in these towns. There are 80, 90-year-old houses that are in terrible disrepair because the people who built them died in them, effectively, and in their last 20-odd years of life were not really doing a good job maintaining them. Not their own fault, they were in their 90s or whatever. So they're not in good condition, and they need a lot of work and a lot of effort to spring up to modern standards. Okay? Then you have houses that are in good condition and at a good price point, and those are sold immediately. When I say sold immediately, I mean offers within day. Yes, within day. And then you have a third option. You have comically expensive house for the region. It might be a nice house, but it's too expensive for anyone to buy, so it just sits there on the market. They can't get rid of it. But this isn't just rural Nova Scotia. This is also Halifax, too. Now, the houses in Halifax are more expensive. The house you could not possibly sell in rural Nova Scotia is the one that sells immediately in Halifax. But then there's also another level of house that is unfathomable in rural Nova Scotia, but is completely unsellable in Halifax, which is in about the $1 million range, 800 to 1.2 million. Unsellable. Years or months on the market to get that sold right now. Unless it's a really, really good house in a really, really good area. So what am I getting at with this anecdote, right? Well, that's how bad the housing situation is. If it's functionally impossible to buy a house, even if you have means, you have a good job, you have everything going together, but you can't do it, that's going to cause a lot of resentment against the status quo. And the status quo, after 8 years, is the Liberal government. And the story and anecdote I just gave is replicated in Vancouver's, in the Torontos, in even smaller city Ontario, places like London or Niagara or Kitchener. That's why when you look at the polls and you look at all of this data, you see time and time again the Liberals doing poorly with the young and the Conservatives suddenly and shockingly doing very well. As an example, in under 35s, the Conservatives have a 13 percentage point lead. But in 55 plus, the Conservatives merely have a 6.5 point lead. Sorry, 7.5 point lead. In the 35 to 55 range, they are at a 16 point lead. Notice under 35s are the people who want to buy a house but can't. And the 35 to 55s are the ones who do have a house but still have a mortgage. Now there's other factors too, cost of living, inflation, etc., etc. But it the Conservative lead in these demographics very neatly maps to who is feeling housing the most. And there's very little Trudeau can do right now, today, to fix housing. Maybe in a 4-year term, you could do something about construction, but short of dramatically reducing immigration, there's nothing Trudeau can do. And to dramatically reduce immigration would require him to overtly reject a core part of liberalism. And to do that is almost unimaginable. But yet, that's likely why he's going to lose. But with that, I will bid you adieu, and I will see you next week, hopefully with something different, but we will see.